morning of April 19th, 1775, 70 armed American colonists approached a company of British soldiers in the Lexington, Massachusetts town square. They called themselves Minutemen, and their leader, Captain John Parker, warned.
Stand your ground. Don't fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have war, let it begin here.
Seconds later, a shot rang out. The British had fired and 8 colonists lay dead. The American Revolution had begun. Just a few years earlier, who could have imagined a war between the 13 colonies in their mother country? At parties, loyal Americans toasted King George III, and they proudly waved the British flag as they marched in parades. Why were the colonists and the British ready to make war? Many years after the Revolution, John Adams, second President of the United States, was asked when he thought the American Revolution began.
The revolution, you see, was in the minds of the people, and this took place long before a drop of blood was drawn at Lexington.
What was this revolution in the minds of the people? How had distance and differences turned them from loyal subjects to rebels? What were the causes of the American Revolution? To understand the answers, we must first of all ask, who were these Americans? Native American people had dwelled in these vast forest lands for many thousands of years. The rest were newcomers. Many, the children and grandchildren of immigrants from the British Isles, from Germany, France, and other places in Europe. They had come to seek a better life, and often for religious freedom. Nearly all were farmers. Other colonists had come against their will. African people were brought to work the farms of the southern colonies. Life for the first American colonists was very hard. They carved roads, farms, and cities out of the forests. Much was learned from the Native Americans who knew the land well. From small beginnings in the early 17th century, the population of the English colonies grew to over 2 million by 1763. Alexander Macalister was typical. He came to America from Scotland, and he wrote his friends back home, "As for the country, it's a very good one for a poor man who will work hard. Everything he puts in the ground will grow. Tell old poor people whom you wish well to take courage and come to this country." Many colonists agreed. Living far from Europe and often far from each other, they were proud of their new communities in the wilderness and had learned to think for themselves. The American colonies were multicultural, unlike any other in the world. Each new immigrant group added its own customs and beliefs, from Jews to Quakers to Moravians. Africans taught ways to plant rice and introduced new musical instruments like the banjo. By 1763, the colonists had their own newspapers and their own colleges. They were beginning to call themselves Americans. Americans also shared in governing themselves. They elected officials to represent them in colonial assemblies, as their lawmaking branch was called. Of course, not everyone had the right to vote. Only white males who owned a certain amount of land could vote. Women, blacks, and Native Americans could not vote. Still, the colonial assemblies encouraged Americans to believe they had a right to take part in government. No one liked taxes, but the colonists accepted being taxed by their own representatives. At the same time, strong ties also continued with England. Colonists learned to speak and read English. Judges and lawyers dressed in traditional English style. People of wealth copied British styles. Virginia planters even enjoyed fox hunting, a popular sport of English lords and ladies. Another powerful link with the mother country was trade. Ships crossed the Atlantic Ocean to England, carrying logs from New England forests, barrels of tobacco from Virginia plantations, and tar and turpentine from the Carolinas. They returned with silver dinnerware, fine pianos, and beautiful dresses made in England. Americans were good customers for British goods. The strongest tie between the colonies and the mother country was government. But ruling the colonies across a vast ocean was hard. It could take months to deliver a letter or newspaper from England to the colonies. Piracy and storms were always a threat. Americans, therefore, learned to look after their own affairs. But this was about to change. What ties linked the colonies to England? What differences were starting to pull them apart?
It's funny to think this little country controlled most of America.
Yeah, well, the French, the Spanish, and the Dutch also tried to control America.
They must have not gotten along very well.
No, they didn't at all. The British got into a war with the French, and they ended up taxing American colonists to help pay for it. The colonists really hated that.
I guess that's another reason why the colonists rebelled against the British.
Yep.
The British were not the only Europeans in North America. The French, Spanish, and Dutch were there too. In 1754, Britain began fighting the French for control of North America. This struggle was called the French and Indian War. Many Indian nations sided with the French, while others fought alongside the British. However, some felt like this Creek chief.
Young men and warriors, the sky is blue. Everything is quiet on the face of the earth, and the blood of men ought not to be spilt.
For many Native Americans, the warfare among the Europeans was one more disturbing aspect of colonial settlement. British victory in 1763 forced France to give up most of its North American lands. Now Britain had a larger empire, but it also had bigger worries. First, the war had cost a lot of money. Who would pay the costs? Second, England now had to rule over French Canadians and many more Native Americans. Just then, the Indian leader Pontiac led a major attack on British forts all along the Great Lakes. To stop the fighting, the government issued the Proclamation of 1763. This drew an imaginary line down the Appalachian Mountains. Americans could not settle west of this line until the Indians agreed to give it up. The fighting stopped, but many colonists resented the ban on westward expansion. And there was still the question of who would pay for the new empire. The British wanted Americans to pay more. Americans paid very few taxes, and they had gained the most from English victory. They no longer had to worry about the French. It seemed fair that they should help pay for the war. So, in 1764, Parliament passed two new taxes. The Currency Act said colonists could not print their own paper money. The colonists were disturbed because it made it harder for them to do business with each other. They were even more unhappy about the Sugar Act. It taxed goods such as sugar, wine, and coffee that came from other countries. This was part of Britain's trade plan for all its colonies. Raw materials were sent to England, where they were manufactured into products such as clothing, ships, and smoking tobacco. These finished goods were then sold back to the colonists. For years, most colonists had ignored these laws. They had smuggled in all kinds of things from other countries. They drank French wines and ate Dutch cheeses. Now the British taxed sugar and meant to enforce it. The colonists were angry. Sugar was important, especially in New England. People used it to make molasses and rum. They cooked with it and traded it for other goods. 8 colonies officially asked Parliament to repeal the Sugar Act. Many colonists denounced the act as taxation without representation. Sam Adams of Boston said,
"With this tax, you have made us slaves, not subjects of the king. You have no right to tax without giving us a representative in Parliament."
What was the French and Indian War? What were the effects of the French and Indian War on the American colonists?
So how did the colonists show their anger toward Great Britain?
Well, they'd write angry letters to the leaders of the British government. They'd boycott any of the British products, and they even burned effigies of the tax collectors.
So they tax things like sugar with the Sugar Act.
And paper products with the Stamp Act. And they also had the Quittering Act.
The next year, in 1765, Parliament passed two more unpopular laws. One was the Quartering Act. This law said the colonists had to pay to room and feed British soldiers if army quarters were full. Many colonists saw no reason to have soldiers remain in America, eating their food and sleeping in their beds. Then there was the hated Stamp Act. People would need special stamps for everything from newspapers and playing cards to deeds and wills. Pennsylvania's leader, Benjamin Franklin, spoke for many.
Americans all agree that Parliament has a perfect right to decide who we should trade with and what we should trade, but no right at all to tell us what taxes we should pay for our own country.
5 colonies joined in demanding an end to the stamp tax. English lawmakers were shocked. The new taxes would only pay a small part of the cost of protecting the colonies. British leader Charles Townshend said,
Oh, these Americans are spoiled children who have been raised, fed, and protected by us until they grew strong. Now they complain about giving us the small amount we ask of them to lighten the burden which we lie under.
Virginia's young leader, Patrick Henry, denounced the Stamp Act in the Virginia Assembly. He claimed that only Virginians could tax Virginians. Excited lawmakers backed Henry's ideas, but the next day, they changed their minds. By then, though, news had spread to other colonies that all of Patrick Henry's radical resolves had been endorsed. Virginia was the first and oldest colony, and other colonies looked up to her. Patrick Henry's resolves made colonists elsewhere bolder. Colonists in Boston decided to stop the stamp distributors. If they couldn't give out stamps, England could not collect her taxes. On August 14th, 1765, a crowd gathered to hang a puppet of Boston stamp agent Andrew Oliver from a tree in the center of town. They went to a building they thought was a stamp office, tore it down, built a huge fire, and burned the puppet. Their protest worked. Andrew Oliver gave up his job. All over the 13 colonies, groups soon formed called the Sons of Liberty. In one case, they tarred and feathered an agent and poured tea into his mouth. By November 1765, when the Stamp Act was supposed to start, there was only one agent left. He quit after 2 weeks. Colonists also found peaceful ways to fight the Stamp Act. In October 1765, representatives of 9 colonies met in New York. This Stamp Act Congress told Parliament that Americans had the same rights as other English citizens. Many store owners in the colonies agreed not to buy goods from Britain until the Stamp Act was dropped. Merchants who resisted the trade boycott soon faced angry crowds. One merchant was treated roughly.
While I resisted, my house was smeared with paint and with the filth of an old outhouse. It smelled so badly that I could hardly stay in it for 2 or 3 days. I thought my life was in danger. I asked the government to protect me, but they said they could not. So to save my life and property, I gave in.
The boycott of British goods was successful. London merchants begged Parliament to end the Stamp Act, and early in 1766, it was repealed. Why did colonists object to the Stamp Act? How did they show their unhappiness with that tax?
Why did the British choose to tax sugar?
I think they chose sugar because it was something that the colonists used in everyday life for making things like rum and molasses.
So that's why the Stamp Acts taxed legal documents and newspapers, because people like to read those too.
Well, they also taxed things like dice and playing cards because the colonists did like to gamble sometimes.
I think the British chose to tax things that colonists had to use in everyday life so that they could get more money.
Well, I can see why they resisted that, because it affected their daily lives so much.
Yeah, it must have really bothered them.
Parliament was still determined to raise money to pay for its American colonies. When Charles Townshend was put in charge of the British Treasury in 1767, he called for new taxes on paper, glass, and even tea. Throughout the colonies, women showed their outrage at this new tax by refusing to buy tea and joining protest groups. However, even in their anger at the British, this poet noted that women had little say in the affairs of the colonies.
Let the daughters of liberty nobly arise, and though we've no voice but a negative here, stand firmly resolved, and bid Townshend to see that rather than freedom, we'll part with our tea.
Led by Massachusetts, the American colonial assemblies began circulating a strong petition of protest. Royal officials were very angry. The governor of Massachusetts ordered the assembly to recall the petition, and lawmakers were ordered not to discuss it. Instead of calming the colonists, it just stirred up more cooperation between them. When the Massachusetts Assembly refused to recall the letter, the governor promptly sent them home. The same thing happened elsewhere when assemblies tried to discuss the Massachusetts letter. Colonists found many ways to display their resistance. In Boston, silversmith Paul Revere made a punch bowl he engraved with the names of the men in the Massachusetts legislature who had voted against withdrawing the letter of protest. Women also joined the fight against the Townshend Acts. Throughout the colonies, groups called the Daughters of Liberty formed. Members spun their own cloth to show they did not need to buy English cloth. They fed their families food grown in America and made teas from herbs instead of drinking tea from England. The most famous protest by women was a tea party in Edenton, North Carolina, where women agreed to fight British laws. An Englishman thought all this was absurd.
I see in the newspapers that Edenton ladies have held a protest against tea drinking. Is there a female assembly at Edenton too? I hope not, for we Englishmen are even more afraid of the women. If the Edenton ladies attack us, they might crush us into atoms.
Stores selling British products were picketed. Newspapers printed the names of people caught buying British products. Finally, after 2 years, the British had had enough of American protest. In April 1770, a new Prime Minister, Lord North, persuaded Parliament to end all the Townshend taxes except for the one on tea. On the very day that the Townshend Acts were ended, a clash between soldiers and colonists in Boston led to the death of 5 colonists. On the evening of March 5th, 1770, crowds began throwing rocks and snowballs at a group of soldiers. In the crowd was a runaway African-American slave named Crispus Attucks. The mob made fun of the soldiers in their red coats, calling them bloody backs and lobster backs. Attucks urged the crowd on, yelling,
"Don't be afraid! They dare not fire!"
Suddenly, someone shouted fire, and troops shot into the crowd. 4 people were killed and 8 were wounded. 1 died a few days later. Boston patriots quickly named this incident the Boston Massacre. A massacre is the killing of people who cannot defend themselves. The colonists saw these deaths as one more sign of British tyranny. Paul Revere's images burned into the hearts of colonists everywhere. Over the next 2 years, the colonies were quiet, but tensions had not vanished. The colonists still felt that taxation without representation was wrong. King George III said,
"King and Parliament have complete power. For Americans to challenge this power is treason."
Few Americans spoke openly about independence, but the colonists and the mother country seemed set on a collision course. Benjamin Franklin warned the British,
"The seeds of liberty have been planted in America."
Soon, those seeds would grow and flower into a revolution in the minds of the people. The seeds of liberty had been planted in the American colonies for many decades. Differences in religion, country of origin, language, and ways of earning a living helped cultivate a distinctive American identity. Vast distances between the colonies and the mother country made strict governing difficult. The colonies formed their own representative assemblies and resented when laws were passed without their consent. British trade policies treated the colonies as a source of raw materials and markets for her manufactured products. But Americans hoped to build their own industry and control their own trade. The Sugar Act, Stamp Act, and Townshend Act were resisted because Americans resented taxation without representation. These areas of conflict caused tension, but separation was not inevitable. Time would tell whether the seeds of liberty would flower into independence.